Broadcasting now, and we're live. Hey, Chris.
Hey Adam, how are you doing?
Doing great. I'm excited. It's Saturday morning. The weather is beautiful out here where I am in California. I think I see light coming through your window there. Is the weather good
Yep.
there too?
Yeah. It's really beautiful. It's amazing.
Good.
Black flies are the only problems. You know the black flies. You remember those? The gnats that
One of the reasons why I don't live in New England anymore.
that feel like a little tiny smokers convention is putting out their last cigarettes all over your body. That's how it feels to me.
Great narrative. Well, look, I'm dressed casual today, though I've got my Peak Prosperity Resilience t-shirt on because after we talk here, I'm going to run down the street to my neighbors and play a little pickleball.
Pickleball.
Fastest growing sport in the world.
I have never played. An aunt of mine has a pickleball court. She likes it so much, though. So
it is super addictive. So my neighbor has one, and we've discovered it's a great coronavirus way to get some exercise because you're both on your opposite sides of the court. Get a lot of fast twitch running around. So I'm excited to go do that. But I'm more excited to have this webinar. It's been a while since we've done one, and you know, I think what the count is like 120 days since that first coronavirus alert went out, and we've been sort of sprinting ever since. You know, you've done a great job of keeping people up to date on the daily YouTube videos. But we do know that there's a lot of questions that have been piling up in the interim. So we try to get to them when we can. We've been so busy recently, we haven't been able to do it for a couple of weeks. So I'm glad we're going to get a chance to do so now. I've got a bunch of questions that folks emailed in and posted on the site. And for those of you who are watching, there are two key controls at the bottom of the player here for you. One is Q&A. That's really just to comment throughout the conversation here. If you can, share your name and where you're dialing in from. We always like to know where our audience is watching from. But if you want to actually ask a question, there should be, sorry, there's the chat one, which is what I meant. That's where you should tell us where you're from and just make any color commentary. But if you want to ask a question, use the Q&A control, because that's the one I'm going to be monitoring and trying to pull questions from. So Chris, as usual, we already have too many questions to get through in just an hour, printed out alone, but I'm going to do my best to try to ping pong back and forth between the live Q&A and these prepared questions or pre-submitted questions. Last thing, if you're watching this live and you can't stay here for the whole time, you know, got to go make a sandwich, use the bathroom, pick up the kids, whatever. Don't worry. Everybody's going to be getting a copy of the replay video of this. We'll post it on the website so that all of our premium members can get a chance to watch it, whether they are watching it live or later on. With that, Chris, you ready to dive in here?
I am. I just want to say welcome everybody. And I'm looking at the side here. I see Newtown, Connecticut, Lyon, France, Spain, New York, from York, Pennsylvania. We got Napa, California, Australia, Maine, Michigan, Virginia, New Jersey. Wow, coming in from all over the place. So welcome everybody. It's good to be here with you today. And we'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can. But I sometimes give really long answers. So Adam, you have full, just cut me off. If I'm going to burn the whole hour on one answer, just give me the sign.
All right, will do. All right, these aren't in any particular order, though maybe we'll start with the coronavirus questions, probably just because that's top of mind for those that have these questions, and then we'll get into the more general, what I would sort of categorize as sort of general collapse questions. But we'll take anything that folks want us to talk about. All right, how do you obtain hydroxychloroquine? Is that via prescription? And then if you can get access to it, is it something that you take prophylactically or only once you see the onset of symptoms?
You know, I think it was Sand Puppy, the ER doc, relating his experience of his other doctor friends in Virginia. They couldn't even get it there. Some states in the United States are locking it down. Other countries, it's much easier to get access to. It's still a prescription item in the United States. It's not everywhere in the world. Honestly, I think you have to have access to a doctor who's friendly to the idea. It's been, you know, as we've been tracking, it's fully politicized at this point in time. So right now, the legit legal channel is to get it through a doctor. And I think you would only take it prophylactically if you're a frontline worker. I mean, you are really exposed. Otherwise, if I had it in my possession, and I don't have any hydroxychloroquine in my possession, I would only take it once I was reasonably certain I'd been exposed or had the beginning of onset of symptoms. But that's only because I probably would only have one or two dose regimens of it or something like that. So, and that goes to the side, maybe you'll have that other question. It goes along with this, like elderberry is the same thing. I only take elderberry once I get the tickly feeling in my throat. It's not something I'm loading on all the time because I worry it'll lose its effectiveness. But both of those, plus with quercetin, if you're taking those, you got to load those with zinc, right? So make sure that if you are deciding that it's time to take any of those things, you're going to be doing that with zinc.
Can you take a minute and just explain why? What role the zinc plays?
Well, so zinc is its own thing, and inside the cell, it seems to have an inhibitory effect on the RNA polymerase, which is so when the virus first comes into your body, gets into the cell, comes into a lysosome, the RNA is liberated from the center of the package of this virus. All the rest sheds off, and that piece of RNA is like a big long string of letters. It has to be read. Well, it also comes prepackaged with some RNA polymerase, which has to read that, right? It turns it into a series of proteins. Zinc blocks the reading of that. And that's as far as I know. So you need to have a lot of zinc, got to be inside the cell. Very easy to get a serum concentration of it, much harder for it to get inside the cell. And so hydroxychloroquine, quercetin, and some of the common elements that are in elderberry all help zinc get inside the cell. That's the so-called ionophore. Zinc is the ion, the phore is meaning the hole. So they create a hole that allows zinc to get in the cell.
Okay, great. I will move to a question that's very similar to what the part two you anticipated was. Do you see any harm in continuing daily consumption of antivirals, including monolaurin, elderberry juice or syrup, astragalus, and Grover's COVID cocktail, which is, I guess, some sort of gin tonic, for an extended period of time as a prevention measure? You mentioned just a few minutes ago, you said that maybe the effectiveness of things like this wane if you do it on a daily basis for too long. Is that a concern?
Yeah, I don't have any great data on this. I'll just give you my opinion. Any compound that you take ultimately loses its efficacy over time. Your body gets used to it, takes higher loads, different things happen. So the antivirals are things that you want to have a robust immune system. So let's separate all those things you just mentioned there. And I'm not completely familiar with two of them. But anything that's operating in that antiviral thing is really meant to be, when a virus is in there, that's when you want to make sure you've got some of that, you got those things going on. But otherwise, making sure the terrain is prepared, right? So that's the vitamin D3, vitamin C, making sure you have reasonable circulating levels of zinc, selenium, those things all the time. That's good. You'd want a baseline of those. But for myself personally, unless I was frontline, so if I'm working as a nurse, I'm working as a doctor, I'm, a greeter at Walmart or something, where people are maybe coughing on me on purpose because they're angry or whatever. If I was in one of those circumstances, I'd want to be sure that, I would be taking this stuff prophylactically, but I wouldn't want to be doing it for years. It's not, I bet they would lose effectiveness over time, but we don't have data to support that, honestly, because guess how much research is done on awesome stuff like that?
Right.
On.
All right, a very practical question here. Is takeout food from restaurants safe to eat without getting infected by COVID? Can you be infected by eating it if it's on the food?
Yes, you can get infected by eating food. I would say takeout food is, if I was doing that, and I'm not, it would only be stuff that I could reheat, microwave, otherwise stuff like that. I would be less certain about salads and things like that, because a salad is going to be a perfect environment for COVID to actually persist for a while. It's going to be moist and cold and things like that. That's sort of the meat packing plant experience, right? Places with those cooler environments seem to preserve the virus for a longer time. So I wouldn't be comfortable eating things that were fresh produced where somebody else had handled them, unless I was really certain that that restaurant was using best practices to go along. So kind of like that, if they had that, like that video I showed from that place in China, the manufacturing place, like if they had legit, oh, here's how we handle it, and they could be clear about all of that stuff. But if otherwise they say we're paying people less than they would earn on unemployment to come in and prepare your stuff, and we give them a mask every 3 days. That I wouldn't take that risk personally.
Okay. All right. Sorrento. Have you heard anything about this type of therapy? Apparently, it aims to generate an antibody cocktail product that would act as a protective shield against SARS-CoV-2. Any comments about Sorrento?
Yeah, I hope you're a billionaire. These are monoclonal antibodies. The antibodies come in different sort of flavors, right? Polyclonal means that it's a whole mix of antibodies, and they stick against all different kinds of things. So if you took your blood, pulled your serum out, technically that's a polyclonal antibody mix. It's just a mix of them. These other ones are very, very highly engineered things. They're monoclonal antibodies. They're wonderful. They're highly specific. They're highly targeted, and they're just ridiculously expensive to produce. So they work. We've known they work for a long time. We've got some that are targeted against cancer. There's one targeted against the IL-6. They're really good, but every one I've seen, the treatments are in the tens of thousands of dollars. So it's cool. I'm just not sure that they're going to be able to scale those up to anything that would be reasonable. But for people who can afford it, yeah, that would probably be a pretty sweet thing, I think. What we don't know is we don't know that once you get those antibodies in the body, we don't know if that's going to lead to somewhere down the line the antibody-dependent enhancement, that ADE pathway, if that's part of this. We still don't know any of that, right? So in the rush of all these miracle things that people are trying to come up with, including Sorrento's thing or the AstraZeneca / Oxford vaccine trial that just got splashed out, any of those things that are hitting the immune system, we don't know yet what the actual long-term impact of those is going to be. So with that said, if I was on death's door and I had a shot at taking a monoclonal antibody, I would absolutely take it.
Okay. I just think it's worth maybe mentioning for a moment too, spent a lot of time on the site talking about the mainstream press and what seems to be now part of the mainstream science community coming out against hydroxychloroquine, and for many, many reasons. We've said, well, we're not sure the data's there to rule it out as an option. In fact, there's growing amount of evidence that suggests it actually could be quite effective and seems quite cheap. And it's raised the whole question about, is it being suppressed by big pharma because you can't make money off that drug? And then there have been other drugs like Moderna and remdesivir that on just scant evidence have been getting, touted as the next great, hyped as the next great promise. I think it's worth noting that, as tends to always happen with bad news that might impact markets, last night after the market closed, it was released that Gilead's remdesivir really doesn't do much, right?
Mm-hmm. And remember, it also was released emergency. We had to quick unlock this data on that Monday morning because there was the China study, which also came out, which was a full-blown clinical trial, and they gave remdesivir, and it showed no efficacy whatsoever. It didn't impact mortality. It didn't impact viral loads from either the nasopharyngeal or the bronchial lavage washes that they pulled out. So it didn't impact viral loads. Duration of hospital stay or mortality, it was a big fat 0, and then they cracked the seal on the US remdesivir study. He said, oh my gosh, it shortens the hospital stay, wasn't our primary endpoint. We've suddenly made a formerly secondary endpoint into our primary endpoint magically mid-trial, and it was all exciting, right? And they had more data, and that stuff that they just released last night at 6 o'clock, Adam, shows that it's actually a dud. Pretty much a complete across the board dud. And they knew that and still went forward with that huge, exciting stuff. And remember to try and act surprised if people who are insiders sold a lot of stock during that first pop. Just remember, what does your surprise face look like? Here's mine.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Moderna just gave us a front row seat to that this week, right? I mean, that all happened within 36 hours, sort of soup to nuts, rumor to sale by insiders. I think it was 36 million by 2 executives at the company. The company then raised more shares, and then 72 hours later, it was back to its pre-rumor price, right? It was just an incredibly successful surgical strike in terms of bilking gullible investors.
Yeah. No, I mean, golf claps for the execution on that. And, good luck seeing if you are one of those gullible investors on the backside of that, having any sort of day in court or, recourse on that. There's none in the system right now.
Yeah.
Our medicine is both politicized and financialized, and it's a bad combo.
Well, I mean, probably the most egregious example of that with Moderna is that the new White House vaccine czar was on the board of Moderna up until about 4 days before that announcement was made, and was able to dump his shares too. So I mean, it's just crazy. All right, somebody here, Colin, came up with a great idea actually, which is, hey, let's all start a GoFundMe campaign to fund a correct hydroxychloroquine test. That's actually maybe not a bad idea. I'm sure if we've found the right people to do it, Peak Prosperity, and I'm sure other sites would be happy to build awareness of the GoFundMe initiative. So maybe that's something we should talk about at some point.
Yeah, with that big Lancet study that just came out that said hydroxychloroquine not only doesn't work, but maybe makes things worse, where they failed to either mention zinc or control for the timing of administration, which are the only two things that really matter in an antiviral, of course, right? I don't know if it's bots or deluded humans, but a lot of people sort of, came at me on that stuff like, oh my God, and then I sort of pushed back a little and they said, oh, you're always moving the goalposts. And I got to pull out from the April 27th, daily update where I said, no, this is the HCQ study we've been asking for, right? Randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled with zinc, measuring a blah, blah, blah. It's very simple. So here's the key question. Why haven't we had one of those studies done so far? It's June. This thing was breaking in December, right? And you can't convince me that we didn't have intelligence assets either in the Department of Defense or in some other three-letter agency that was fully aware of this on the ground back in December at the latest inside of China, right? We don't sit around waiting for the WHO to get notified officially by China. Nobody does, right? So at any rate, we had that data for a long time. It's 6 months later, and we still don't have a proper trial. In China, as you remember, it was probably in the fourth or fifth video, I'd have to go back and search. We were mentioning, all the things that the Chinese doctors were trying. Chloroquine showed up really early in that whole list. So that was probably a January sort of announcement on our end, where we were just saying, oh, look, they're using this stuff. So there's plenty of time. And we still don't have a proper one. But we've got all these retrospective studies, poring over all the records, trying to fish out data from a place, which basically boils down to, we've concluded that administering airbags after the crash actually is harmful, not helpful. And thinking people everywhere are going, no kidding, really. That's who knew, right? So just crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah. So one last question on this. I can make the argument, whether it's true or not, that they're trying to suppress the cheap solution because it can't make big profits off it. So they're conscripting whoever they can in the media and the science world to poo-poo it. But it seems like recently, the narrative has shifted to, hey, don't take this thing. It's dangerous, right? Neil Cavuto, right, on Fox saying it will kill you, right? Where is, whether we believe it or not, where is the evidence for that coming up, that it's actually has a higher mortality rate than other potential solutions that are out there? Because this drug, I believe, in fact, I don't believe, I know, it's one of the most prescribed drugs in history, right? It's been prescribed for over 70 years, hundreds of millions of times. And by I think it was the WHO's own admission, I think you'd pull that off the WHO's website. There's never been at least I want to say fatality that's been attributed to the drug. Maybe this was in the case of some sort of cardiac death, but it seems to be also not only one of the most prescribed drugs in history, but probably one of the safest from a complication rate standpoint. So how are people morphing that into, this is a fatal decision if you start taking this drug?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a question for a sociologist to dig through. There's maybe a side example which I think is doable in this. There were two big talking points around it. One is, oh my God, it's really dangerous. I don't know where that started from. But another one I was able to track all the way down, which was, this is going to lead to shortages for people who legitimately need this. These are the people with lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. They've been using this drug for years, and now they can't get it. And that was I saw that everywhere. So I managed to chase that all the way back down. And there was one article, I can't remember, I think it was either in Vice or Salon. I'm going to lean towards Salon on this, where a woman who has lupus was writing about her experience that this drug was really useful for her, and she worried that she wouldn't be able to get it. That's it. And that morphed into supply shortages and people who really need it can't get it.
Yeah.
And that was the only source of that, was an anecdote from a woman who was concerned. But I couldn't find a single legitimate example of a shortage. And by the way, we should be able to make this stuff by the ton. If you went to any major pharma company with a pilot plant and said, we need 13 tons of hydroxychloroquine, they'd probably be able to make it in a couple of weeks. It's a very simple compound. I talked to Dave Collum, our on-call chief chemist up there at Cornell, and he's like, "Oh no, that's totally easy. That's an easy thing because we have the precursor for this, which is the cinchona bark, or quinine. And it's like the core molecule of this thing is already pre-constructed by nature. So doing the additions that make it hydroxychloroquine, super simple. So at any rate, but it's not being done. So that I can tell you was just a anecdotal rumor that mushroomed into common knowledge, which is now a talking point for people, which is, oh, all these people hoarding it for COVID are denying people who have legit needs for that stuff from getting it. It's like, there's no shortage. There is no shortage. It's an easy to make drug. Super simple.
Okay. No. All right. We get a question here from Andrew just asking for your latest prognostication on a vaccine potential timeline. Probably the simple question is if everything goes great, what's your ballpark of when we'd see a vaccine at scale? Or maybe we'd see a vaccine at scale no sooner than X in your estimation.
Yeah, still a year away for sure.
Yeah.
So of the ones, there are 5 in clinical development. There's 71 in preclinical development right now. They're doing a lot of skipping of the preclinical stage. Moderna skipped right past every single preclinical. There's going to be a story, I hope somebody's starting to write that book already, because there's a great story there about how a small company with exactly 0 compounds on that platform was able to bypass all the usual preclinical safety stuff. That includes toxicology, tox screening, animal studies, yada, 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 in vitro, in vivo, all kinds of stuff. And they skipped all of that and put this brand new platform vehicle, which is putting mRNA into somebody, right? And the danger of putting, this isn't like a normal vaccine is just bits of a virus particle that your body's used to reacting to. This is actually inserting genetic code into humans, which that's a whole different beast, right? Mm-hmm. And the idea that we understand how that works and there's, that there's no potential complications is complete bunk.
It sounds like a Jurassic Park moment there.
Yeah, it kind of is. So I hope they had really extensive disclosure forms that people understood when they signed up for that initial jab. But I'm less certain about that one. I think that one was actually, there's a lot of suspicion in my mind that Moderna is actually a fraudulent company run by a fraudulent CEO. It bears noting that the Wall Street Journal compared the CEO of Moderna to Elizabeth Holmes, the head of Theranos, the defunct, complete fraudulent company out of Silicon Valley that was doing those micro blood tests allegedly. They compared him to her after Theranos collapsed. So it was a legit, like, this guy's super secretive company. Nobody can see the results. People who have came up with bad results, out of their trials and experiments were fired on the spot. They've been through every key person who's in a position to, like, their chief science advisor was there 2 months, really respected guy, left to spend more time with his family. I mean, it's just all the usual stuff that you see in a fraud. So no hope for that one. Meanwhile, the United States put $1.2 billion towards AstraZeneca to help them speed up the Oxford vaccine, which is a whole different thing. It's an adenovirus. It's a platform we understand. You take a virus, you weld on the spike protein. This virus can't replicate, but it can make the spike protein in your body. Your body makes antibodies. Good to go. That one's more well known, but those have a strong failure track record. You have to keep trying them. Maybe it's this fragment of the spike protein, or it was this, or it didn't replicate well, or we got an immune response, but it went away after 3 weeks. We don't know yet. So that one made it through phase 1. So it was well tolerated, seemed to generate a decent antibody response. But there's so many ways that could fail from here to there. But still, they're putting a lot of firepower behind that one platform right now and that one piece. So even if they went really fast, I bet that's still a year out.
Okay. And I realize I'm asking you just to, like, literally, make your best guess here. But let's assume for a moment a vaccine becomes available. What are the odds that it's a one and done vaccine versus like a flu shot that we're just going to have to get every year, that we're just going to be living with COVID from now on?
That one's trickier. So two answers to that. First, the flu is really a master at disguising itself year after year. It's got a portion of its genome which jumbles itself so that it scrambles up its surface epitope so that your body doesn't quite recognize it next time. The coronaviruses don't do that, but we don't have any successful vaccines against any coronaviruses for humans at this point. There is one in cats, right? You can get a coronavirus injection for cats, but it comes with a big old asterisk on it, which is like, we can give the vaccine to your cat. It will take care of the first time it gets this feline coronavirus, but the second time it might go bad. It's one of those haywire things where the second time is really bad, kills the cat kind of thing. So coronaviruses are just different beasts, and this is too hard to even speculate on. We're going to hope that there's lasting immunity on these things. There's some early signs, right, where they said, well, they looked at the SARS recovered patients, which is in the same sort of family, pretty close, but honestly not that close, genetically speaking. But people there had long-lasting what looked like T cells. Those are the memory cells. So there's two parts of your immune response. One is the B cell, or the part that's making it's called the humoral response. It's making antibodies. That's the stuff floating around in your so-called humerus, in your plasma, circulating, just being those antibodies. And the second is your actual T cell response. This is your cellular response. These are the cells that said, I've seen you before, and they fire up when they see it again. So these tend to last a long time. And they noted that there is T cell response. And in this first AstraZeneca/Oxford vaccine, they noted that the T cells looked activated. But it's really early. I mean, these people are only 4 weeks in. The question is, are those T cells still activated 12 months out? And
Right.
There's nothing but time to tell us that.
All right, 2 remaining questions on COVID, and then we'll get to the more general questions. An anonymous question here said, do we have any data yet on COVID-19 with pregnancy?
Sure. Lots of women have given birth so far, and the infants all seem fine. And so there's been enough time now that women have made it all the way through the 3rd trimester. And so far, nothing's been noted. But I'm going to say so far. Now there's increasing numbers of young children showing up with this Kawasaki-like disease, and there's strange peripheral sort of coagulopathies, seem some sort of vasculopathy, something, we don't know what, but that's where you see the frostbite toes, and now they're getting these rashes and other things that sort of say there's a systemic issue. But again, very, very small numbers of children, tiny relative to population. So I don't think right now, it really honestly still looks like the younger you are, the better off you are. And that would go all the way back in utero.
Okay. So a couple rapid fire questions on that. One, you see your child, not infant, but your child with strange rashes on their toes, fingers, etc. That's get them to the doctor quick to just make sure this isn't that Kawasaki syndrome or whatever it was. Is it that urgent?
Yeah, it really needs to be treated. It's a fairly serious disease that can strike, and there's things they can do to mitigate it.
Okay, and then just restating what you said earlier, we have data that suggests that, as far as we know, we got to qualify all this. A pregnant woman gets coronavirus, COVID-19, carries the baby to term. We're not seeing any lingering long-term issues from that, as far as we know. And secondly, do we know if are the infants being born with COVID-19 in their systems and it's just not bothering them, or are they being born COVID-19 free?
I don't know the answer to that one. I'd heard I'd read one thing where they detected COVID, but you don't know because there's the mother can confer a lot of immunogenicity across that barrier to the child. So there's some things that can cross over. So don't know the answer to that one yet. But so far there haven't been any, as far as I know, exactly 0 reports of fatalities in and around births in infants and young children. Okay.
Oh, that's promising news. All right. Last question on COVID is just, should we start preparing now for a second wave? Do you agree or disagree? This is a good time to restock and prep, especially if you haven't already.
Two questions. I'll start with that last one. Yeah, absolutely. Evie and I, Evie's, she's more alert to these sorts of things. And she's noted that you go on Amazon and you look at Home Depot and there's things missing all over the place right now. It's sort of this, already we're seeing, I think there's probably a huge report I'm going to have to dig in and figure out, because it looks like supply chain breakdowns or something, but there's many items which have long wait times on them right now. And that feels like supply chain issues. It's not really being talked about in the media yet. So yeah, as far as a second wave, New York could face a second wave because it got through a first wave. Alabama is still really working hard to make sure it gets a right, proper first wave. So, for instance, so there are places that have already gotten past it. I think my simple answer to this is any place that culturally can't manage basic mask wearing and hygiene is going to struggle with this the whole way through. And you want to call them waves or this or that. There's not going to be any summer lull, I don't believe. Ecuador's just getting crushed by this thing. Brazil's just getting crushed by this thing. So those would be what I would consider to be summertime temperatures. Doesn't seem to be slowing it down in the slightest. So here's the key. Social distancing, number one, how far apart are you from people? And two, how much time are you spending in proximity with other sick people? Are the prime determinants. And then you have a cultural overlay on top of that, which is, how's your mask wearing? Can you manage to not shake hands, kiss each other's cheeks, be too close to each other, all of that stuff. But those first two really favor rural versus more crowded areas. That's why I am really happy to be living out in pretty much rural Mass at this point in time. When I was at the stores yesterday, everybody was wearing a mask, every single person in every place I went. So I'm glad to be living in that culture. I feel reasonably safe there. I would feel terrible being in those places like in Michigan and Georgia and Alabama and Texas, where people are openly protesting their right to stand close to each other without masks. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't want to be there, not even slightly.
All right. So quick follow-up question on that, and then I'll have a bridge question. What was my follow-up question? Well, whatever. I'll go into the bridge question if I remember the follow-up one. Follow-up one was just, we are now in the process of going back to work, right? States are opening up and whatnot. Again, just asking you to take your best guess. What kind of a spike may we see as the nation begins to get people out of lockdown and back to work as best they can? Do you see it being maybe less of a risk than maybe you would have guessed 2 months ago based on the data that's come through? Or do you see that we're setting ourselves up for kind of the hammer and the dance, right? Where we're letting people out and then having to, push them back into their homes?
Again, local mileage is going to vary. I think that there are some places that have got this under control, and it's just going to be like a slow burn sitting there. These would be Czechoslovakia, like where I live, where everybody's sort of taking it seriously. But, it's hard to keep that sort of vigilance going. And I think what we're going to find is that uncomfortable sort of dance where areas, oh, this is all good again. People relax. Oops, it flares up again. And all of that. That's happening on one level. So that hammer and dance is going to be happening all over the place. I take some instruction from China, who I don't trust a lot, but I do kind of trust that their reactions to things. And so it's just been interesting to watch that every time China finds even one person who's infected in one of these big cities like Jinlin, Wuhan retested all 11 million people who live there because they had one cluster. They're like, that's it. We're testing everybody. So I think that China's actions tell me that they understand very well that you just can't even allow, once you've got this thing under control, you can't let it get started again. So they're going to use the giant hammer on that whole thing. Then we got other places like we just talked about, some of these like sort of hotspots in the US right now and elsewhere in the world where people like Brazil is a complete hotspot because their leader is just a complete fool and a tool around this stuff. It's just the flu. It's no big deal. And they're digging mass graves like nobody's business. Right. So as far as I can tell, this is something we can learn to live with. but you can't have idiots as managers. And you got to have people who take it seriously, or you're going to be facing, like right now, the article this morning in Newsweek was Birmingham is out of hospital beds. They're crushed by this thing at this point in time, right? And they were taking sort of what I would call an idiot response to this.
Okay, and that's sort of what I was going to ask was, Georgia's now been open for a couple of weeks, I think. Have we seen any early indications that there's a resurgence in infections in some of these states that have opened up early, or do we just not have the data yet?
I don't know. I never recombined the dates on that chart they put out. I should have.
Yeah, that's right. For those that didn't see the video, Chris is talking about some data that Georgia published that said, oh, look, here we're being transparent about infections in Georgia. And the timeline that they created was just a kind of number soup. In other words, the dates weren't in chronological order. In fact, I think the only order they were in was in sort of a descending curve, which is really comforting until you realize it has absolutely no bearing on the actual timeline. So anyways, all right, here's the bridge question I was going to ask. We're now going to get into more sort of the general collapse questions, which are around both the economy and resilient living and the need for it and whatnot. Somebody's asking here, in defense of a round two, the second wave that might be coming. These people live on a small farm, sort of a rural property. Which supplies would you recommend they stock up on? Feed, fencing, hutches, etc. And the reason why I'm making this the bridge question is because you could answer this question of, hey, just what's important to have if you're trying to develop a resilient homestead, right? Coronavirus or not.
Yeah.
So what would you be prioritizing right now?
This is a tricky one. So personally, what the strategy Evie and I are running is to just get everything done that needs to get done as fast as we can while we can. So our field needs a lot of lime. So we probably have to get 6 to 8 tons of lime put on it. And so I'm just going to do that, pull the trigger on that because I can do that. And I'm prioritizing anything that requires large, heavy machinery to operate and bring stuff from long distances. We're doing that too. We're probably going to get some cows at them. Looks like we're getting some shipped in, and very fortunate to get them because a month ago they were easy to get, and now they're not. So we're finding this general supply chain thing. One of the things we're not doing in our household is assuming that because we can get it today, we can get it tomorrow. So we're actually having to run through our checklist and say, what do we really actually want? What would be important? And having cows is going to be really important to us because we need them to recondition the fields for us and churn them up and chew the grass and poo on it and do all the stuff that we need to get these fields back into working order. We'd rather have nature do that than machinery. So that's part of that. But in order to do that and do that well, you have to have a big, long electric fence. So now I default to my old rock climbing motto, which is the same as what the Navy SEALs say, which is if you have one, you have none. Meaning in days gone past, I might buy a single field fence charger, say, oh, I got one. And if it breaks, I'll go get another one. Now we have 2, right? One in the box, one in the field. And so we're doing that with pretty much everything we can think of. When you source where almost all of these things come from, like you had those fence panels, the big long 16 footers and they're welded. Yeah, those are great. How much of that comes from Chinese steel? I don't know. So we're going to get some of those and have extras. Right now, if you wanted to go to Fedco, which is a big seed and tree and shrub supplier, and you wanted to buy anything from a hazelnut to a cherry tree, they right on the front of their website, they're almost screaming at you. We're not taking any more orders, right? The first time they're going to take orders for 2021 is starting in October, right? When their new catalog comes out. There is nowhere that I can find right now to buy mycelium if you wanted to inoculate logs to create your own mushrooms, lion's mane or hen of the woods, or they're all gone. So, and maybe they'll get back in stock at some point in time. So we're finding supply shortages for the kind of stuff we want. I would advise people to look very carefully at what they think they might want to do within the next 12 months and proactively buy what you think you might be needing for that.
Great. I'm going to just ask a part 2 to this question because Lisa and a few others have asked this. So you just sort of talked about sort of homestead, more on the outside, outdoors resources. What else would you be stocking up inside right now, whether it's for a second wave or just whatever risks you see are most likely in the future?
So there's some various appliance shortages going on. I hear, I haven't tried, but people tell me that the earliest you could possibly get a freezer is sometime out in July. Those are all back ordered.
Someone's making that comment here about it. Can't finding a chest freezer. Yeah.
Yeah. So those went away a while ago. Uh, so that's a harder question because it's kind of hard to stockpile appliances, but that's something that could go away. The reason a chest freezer is going to be so important is because we may well be going through hiccups in our supply chain. So, we just went through a period where there was like more beef and pork than you could know what to do with because the supply chains got wrecked on the commercial side. So they funneled all the animals they could into the retail side. It was just cheap. But now there's literally no animals left to go into that side. So we'll face the other side of that. You remember the beer distributor game where you try and get your supply chains all worked out? We all did this, and Adam and I did this in business school. It's a fun game. And all you're trying to do is you can't see the people on either side of you. They either submit orders, right? Or you have an inventory and an order book that you have to fill. And it just is your goal is to make as smooth as possible as you can. Every team, all hyper competitive MBA students, give it a try. And everybody ends up with this wildly ridiculous, blown out supply chain experience. And that's just what happens. So I'm expecting a lot of supply chain wildness. And so my strategy is when it's abundant, that's why I have a freezer full of meat right now, is because when all of that was abundant and I could still get a freezer, I filled it up. Now it's a little bit harder to do that. I think it'll be easy again. It'll be hard again. I think we're going to see that happening for a while. As well, I would also, for anybody who's thinking about this, you're going to want to have the ability to store whatever vegetables finally do come out in this summer, whether you can access from your own garden or from a CSA, if you can get cases or bushels of tomatoes or whatever happens to be abundant, how would you store that? And so I'm a big fan of having dehydrators, big fan of pre-buying the sorts of, if you have freezer space, the tubs and things that you would be able to freeze in. There's a variety of crock pots that you can use if you're going to turn anything into a fermented good, things like that. So inside the home, Evie also very smartly, I think, Macy's, I think they're going out of business. Anyway, they were throwing down comforters out the door at like $80. I'm convinced that China's where we get most of the down for that stuff from their processes. I'm not convinced that down comforters won't go back up to $300-400 like they were when I was growing up at some point. So there's just my advice is just note what's being literally thrown out the door because there's a hiccup in the supply chain. And there'll be a wave of bankruptcies, which I think people can take advantage of. From the major stores that are going to be going out. JCPenney's in bankruptcy. If anybody needs a used car and you don't mind buying a stripped down base model Dodge Charger, Hertz has got your it's got everything you need right now.
Yep.
So there'll be moments like that. I would advise, just take advantage of them if that's something you think you need, but it's a little defensive right now. I don't know what's happening in the future. I really don't.
I think to your point there too, I would recommend that people keep an eye on Craigslist, particularly for things like chest freezers and things that, you'd like to get that aren't in stock right now, only because sadly, we're beginning to see some of the commercial bankruptcies. You just mentioned Hertz, with almost 40 million people out of work over the past 9 weeks. And of course, those are the only ones that we know about. There's a little bit of a calm before the storm as people are beginning to get their unemployment paychecks and the extra $600 a week and whatnot. But that's not going to last forever. And I think, sadly, by the summer, certainly I think by fall, we're going to see a lot of those people who have not been reemployed at that point really beginning to kind of fall into hardship, and we'll probably be liquidating a lot of things. So it's a sad reason, but there probably will be a lot of inventory of used goods, flooding into places like Craigslist and whatnot. So, set up an alert, keep your eye out for stuff. Two things that you mentioned. One, the beer game. We've talked about that both in terms of operations and supply chains, but we've also talked about it in terms of sort of financial and monetary policy, in the sense that what that game really conveys to you is that when you don't have perfect information and people are making sort of their best guesses on what the future is going to be, things can get wildly out of hand wildly quickly. And to me, it sort of just reinforces the law of unintended consequences, both from a policy standpoint and in terms of inventory overage and outages. And I think that we are entering a period of greater uncertainty. The coronavirus has certainly injected a ton of uncertainty and volatility in the mix. And so to your underlying point, I think we need to be prepared for not just supply chains, but for sort of all elements of life as we know it to become a lot more unpredictable. And that's why a lot of this preparing becomes extra prudent in this case. And then when I first started reading you, Chris, this is before I think we started working together, you had bought your old house in Montague. And I remember being surprised because you had been one of the guys who had written a lot about the housing bubble and whatnot. And I remember at the time you said, hey, look, I don't really ever expect to be above water in this property in terms of being able to sell it for what I bought it for. But right now I value time more than I do money, right? Meaning getting moving on the things that are important to me, getting the orchards in, getting infrastructure built that will be there for me in terms of hardship. Sounds like you're saying very much the same thing right now. True?
Absolutely. And I wrote a piece closing in on a year ago, I think, where I talked about the next great land rush. And it was based on my own experience now having searched for and then purchased this property that we're on right now. And just noting that in that I had an entire 2-state range, my only constraint was I wanted 10 acres or more, but I was still searching down in the 5-acre range. And then I would overlay anything I could find with a soil map. The USDA's got these really wonderful soil maps right down to the meter. You can see exactly what's under each piece of property. And so then I would exclude all the things which are gorgeous houses, but parked on a rubble pile of rocks and otherwise, distressed land, and was just looking for where's good soil. And turns out that places with good soil come up for sale rarely. They may not hit Zillow at all because they tend to pass from interested party to interested party more privately. And at any rate, my experience was there were like 30 properties that floated to the top of my list. And then I ran the numbers and said, well, what percentage of Boston would have to decide they wanted to compete with me on those before, this was a much different process. And I was suddenly, outbid and outgunned and all kinds of things. And the answer was, yeah, it's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent. It's just tiny. And so I thought that movement is coming. This is way before COVID came, but I knew that eventually people would start to say, hey, cities aren't all that, they're great. Maybe I'll have a place in the city, but maybe I also want a place out in the country. Well, that's just gone into overdrive right now. There was even an article in the New York Times a week ago, which talked about the great resuburbanization, like houses in Connecticut on the Metro North line are flying off the shelves right now because New Yorkers are just doing anything to scoot out of the city into suburban Connecticut. I think they'll re-examine that and say, geez, maybe I need to go even further afield. So I think that's already started.
When's the tax bills arrive from the state of Connecticut?
Yeah. So,
I'm from Connecticut, so I can relate to that.
Once upon a time I was too. So they'll rethink that one because Connecticut's in terrible shape. I think politically and from a tax standpoint. But once that starts though, I think, we're going to find that people are, I know somebody asked a question on this. I was reading on their website and asked, real estate. And so let me decompose that. I think it's a terrible time to buy into many of the bubblicious urban markets out there. I think that once people start to understand that COVID's not going away and that it's actually density of population that matters almost more than anything else. And so being a little bit more rural just confers an ease to life where you don't have to be on guard every minute. I'd be terrible in the city. I'd be terrible. Every surface I touched, I'd be thinking it was covered, it'd feel to me like it was nuclear waste. I'd be like, I gotta go home and wash, I wouldn't want to live around that kind of anxiety if I was carrying that, as a point of view. And I wasn't, hadn't had COVID and was immune. So I actually think that when you ask about real estate, I do believe there's going to be more and more people moving into what I would call urban, suburban, rural being on where they would go. Maybe that's just me talking my own book because that's the decision I made. Possible. But I do think that we have a lot of evidence that started, and it makes sense too. So this is back to the land movement. So if somebody said, is now the right time to buy Real estate, the answer is no. If you're in an urban center, absolutely. If you're thinking about moving a little bit more rural into a place where you could begin to support your family with respect to food and water.
All right. I'm going to push against that just for 1 second because I'm guessing others have the question. There's lots and lots of reasons to believe that real estate is going to have a real hard time over the next couple of years, right? You know, commercial real estate, you know, it's going to be Armageddon there, right? But even we've had regular residential real estate back up at you know, sky high valuations relative to the things that you're supposed to evaluate real estate against. And like we said earlier, we've got at least 40 million people. 1 in 4 U.S. workers has basically been laid off so far. So that's going to have a huge ripple effect in terms of affordability. And housing is priced at the margin, right? You only need a few houses to sell for under the average in a neighborhood before the entire neighborhood is valued lower. So I guess the question is if we do go into a real estate correction, what do you think is going to win out more in the more rural areas? The correcting real estate market or the demand from people who are trying to get out of the urban environments to a place that's more self-sufficient? Sounds like you're saying maybe the latter.
Could be. So,
and I asked this question for the person who's thinking, maybe I should wait a year to see if prices go down in my target rural market and then buy them.
Yeah, two answers to that. The first is I still believe that time is more important than money, but maybe not everybody has that particular luxury. I get that. But ultimately, if you're buying land doesn't move that much in price historically, even, you know, in the big busts and everything. You know, what does break down are the big, ugly trophy properties with the massive tax bills on them. So one of the states I was looking at was New Hampshire, right? New Hampshire has this horrible property tax, 2.4% on average. And so it just means that if you bought $1 million house, you're paying 24 grand a year in property taxes, right? That's a $24,000 bill out the door every single year, like clockwork. You know, it's like having a kid in college forever, right? You know, that's part of it. But if you buy the land and you put it in an agricultural piece and there's, you know, really nothing on there that's a super improvement in terms of the living structure, that the property taxes are really quite controllable. So the land doesn't get hit as hard. You're going to find those $1 million properties in New Hampshire, and there's a ton of them, or more. You know, they're going to have a hard time finding buyers for those because it's, you know, that's trickier. So land is really something, you know, productive land, I think is always a good thing. And then it's the time, right? So I had the most glorious Concord grapes at my old house, and I just put my new little twigs in, you know. So I'm starting over, and it's going to take 5 years for those to get up. It's going to take me 5 years to get this field into production. It's going to take me 5 or 6 years to get all the energy systems worked out. It's going to take 3 to 4 years to get the elderberries up to early mature stage. It's just time. So the question is, how much time do you feel you have? From an economic standpoint, you said purely economically, wait. Absolutely. I think prices go down, but you have to have your buy list ready, and you need to be ready to pull that trigger on the properties you want, because Adam, I think this is a V bottom in the sense that I think there comes a moment where the Federal Reserve says $1,200 ain't cutting it per person. We need to get 12,000 or 200,000 or whatever the number is. There's going to be a number that's much bigger as we get into the POOM stage of this, because this is how all these currency systems end. Printing.
All right.
I think that's coming.
We're going straight into that question. Before we do, related back to the preparation questions, somebody had asked, how do I determine how much food to store if I'm looking to create food stores for my family, long-term food storage? I am putting in the Q&A right now a link to the food calculator at the Provident Living's website. It's run by the Mormons, the Church of Latter-day Saints. There's nothing religious about it, but they are at the forefront of the food storage movement. They've got an excellent calculator there. There's the link to it. All right, Chris, so I do want to get to some other questions here, and you basically just sort of pulled out a huge rare steak for the people that are concerned about hyperinflation. So let's go straight there. You mentioned a V bottom. I got to ask you to put some timing around that because I'm sure that caught people's attention. Are you saying there's going to be a V bottom like later this year? Are we going into the POOM stage later this year? Or are you thinking, over the next couple of years, we'll see that type of response by the central planners?
It all depends. I mean, we had Jerome Powell out on 60 Minutes, and he basically all but begged a fiscal response by the U.S. government. He's like, "What can we do? We can go off script a little bit, but not that far. So we're going to buy some corporate bonds. We'll buy some ETFs. We'll buy some junk bonds. We'll buy stuff that we never even, it's not in our mandate or remit to buy. But there's really only so far the Fed can go. And what I'm talking about is you need to get money into the hands of the people. Forget pumping up stocks and making sure the banks are all solvent and all that stuff. To get this thing out of the doldrums and to correct something which is this is the biggest shock we've ever seen economically, ever. So this is really the elephant that's been fatally shot and is still walking around at this point in time. Give it a few months and all of a sudden, like, the real impacts of this are going to start showing up, and there's going to be a very strong push in Congress and the Senate to do something. And don't forget, it's an election year. So, there's going to be, double the usual desire to be really generous in this particular stage. So what I'm kind of keying on is, what is the size of the next stimulus bill and how does that get put forward? Anything short of like a really massive, nearly a debt jubilee sort of a response I think is going to be underwhelming. $1,200 didn't do it. $600 a week for people out of work ain't going to do it. I'm talking like real substantial help at this point in time. Complete tax holiday by the federal government for all people. I don't know what, something, right? And it's whatever they've been doing is not sufficient to arrest the declines that are coming. So if they don't do anything, if for some reason election year politics works against us because it's too fractured and the Democrats and the Republicans hate each other to figure anything out, and they think they can sort of hang this dead mackerel around the other party's neck and blame them for not helping people out. Barring that, we're going to see, I think, just a massive, massive stimulus bill coming out. I mean, really big. Like, let's put 30 million people to work, CCP style, the old Civilian Conservation Corps, this kind of stuff. CCC, not CCP. I got the wrong. They've really infected my brain. So
although the CCP does a great job of getting millions of people to do whatever it wants.
It does. So yeah, too many C's, it works against you. So at any rate, but I mean, like massive sort of jobs bills kind of a thing. And they're going to have to, but what would be my threshold for that? It would have to be a federal stimulus package in the vicinity of maybe 4 or 5 trillion, something like that. Because I think under that, I think 3 to 4 trillion or less merely patches the hole in the road. It doesn't actually create more than that.
Right. Although, just as an FYI, the HEROES Act, which is still a bill at this point, is in the 3 trillion range. So there's already plenty more on its way in the interim.
I know, but if that's all they can manage to concoct, I don't think that's going to do it. So that doesn't do it. I look at that, I'm a little underwhelmed. There'll be a small, shortish recovery, but what's going to be hard for people to, again, Adam, all I have to do is default to this. Just look at the oil demand graphs. That'll tell you everything you need to know. If oil is not being consumed, the economy isn't happening. And next thing you know, you can't buy sheets on Amazon because something else broke down. I mean, it's just too interconnected. So you could do worse than to just track the oil demand numbers at this point in time.
All right. So many questions coming out of what you just said. We are coming up on the hour mark. Let's go another 10, 15 minutes or so and just try to cram as much as we can.
Yeah.
All right. So sort of quick answers, but oil demand charts, what are they showing right now?
Absolute cratered demand at this point in time. Slight uptick, but not a lot.
What are we talking about? 40% drop, more or less?
No, I think we're hovering in around the 20 to 22% drop right now. It's hard to figure out what's true in that though, because there's been a lot of stuffing of the pipeline. So right about now through the next 2 months, we're going to get a better read because there are no more tankers to fill up and float on the oceans. All the on-land tanks are full, and we have all of the reduced output that's happening. So it's going to take a while to sort of figure that out, because normally every day's operating at full output. That's your steady number in figuring all this out. And then they look at the actual amount that's in storage, and the gap between those two tells you demand. Now with storage being topped up and this coming down, and demand, it's like 3 big moving pieces. So 2 of those get factored out soon, and we'll have a better read. But right now it looks like about 20%. And that leads to a secondary minor conclusion, which is that you remember in the 3 days after 9/11, researchers noted that the Earth heated up the most that they had seen because there weren't planes in the air, creating a lot of particulates and smog and other things. So my guess is that we're going to see with this massive drop in industrial demand, a lot of heating this year from a climate change standpoint. And I think that would lead to a secondary prediction, which is we might see a lot more of those 500-year rain events and big storms and stuff like that.
2020, bad year to be an insurance company.
2020, you know what I just read this morning? China has 5,000 troops across the border in India digging in, and it didn't even make a peep. It's in India's news. Like that's how bad 2020 is. China just invaded India, didn't even make my newspaper.
Not to rat hole in that, is that just to be a line of defense in case things get so bad in India with COVID that China is keeping them out, or is it more aggressive than that?
They've been skirmishing for a while at the border. And so there's one disputed region. And so it's sort of been a back and forth. And, maybe they dig in for a week just to make a point and then they back off and all that. But that's not some rogue colonel deciding to make a point. China doesn't operate that way. So, but again, I mean, like in last year, that's news. This year, it's like
That's like page 8 at this point. All right. So 2 questions I'm going to combine into one. One of the big questions that's been out there for over a decade, but is really getting batted around now, and you mentioned POOM, right? Is the whole inflation, deflation, is the KAPOOM theory still in play? If so, what are the odds of a deflationary event happening again? I mean, we're in the midst of a deflationary event. I mean, you could call what's going on right now a cough phase that's being forced on us by the coronavirus. We're definitely seeing, a huge amount of response so far, but to your point, not enough. So 2 things. May we just go straight to POOM? Right? Are those folks that are still, positioning for another down leg in the market and whatnot? Are there odds that might not happen at this point? And then secondly, you and I were talking about, what are going to be some of the signals that cause us at Peak Prosperity to set out an alert that says, all right, folks, now is the time to literally just convert whatever paper currency you have into something tangible, right? We're not there yet, based on our assessment. But what are indicators that you'll need to see to start, getting ready to put out an alert like that? So odds of deflation and then signs of hyperinflation.
Okay, a quick couple of terms, because I see Catherine asks here, what is a V bottom? And we're talking about economically, if you have a decline, does it make a V shape because it just spikes right back up, or does it make more of a U shape because it takes a long time, or do you make an L because it never really actually recovers? And the POOM that Adam's referring to then is there's an implosion, there's a KAPOOM. The POOM is the inflationary explosion. And the question is, we've already had a little bit of that deflation, but is the Federal Reserve and other central banks going to fight so hard that we skip straight over pretty much into this inflationary explosion? Yeah, so right now, the risk of an inflationary outcome on this is very high. It's climbing. What I'm watching for very, very carefully is going to be a turnaround in some of the key things that when big money gets scared about stuff, you know what they do? They don't want to hold money in certain areas, and that would be in bonds. So bond prices are the number one thing I'm going to be checking out. If bond prices inexplicably start falling, so interest rates start going up despite the Federal Reserve's best efforts, that's because big money is saying, I don't want to be trapped in a 0% asset in a period of time, and money is about to start losing whole percentages over time. And there are other canaries in that particular coal mine. Gold is an okay one. I think it has too much utility as a signaling mechanism by the central bank, so it's not a pure indicator. But the price of oil would be another one, a lot of commodities, things like that. So I'm watching the commodity complex very carefully. I do have a buy list. I do have cash saved up. I do have an idea that I will run, not walk, if certain things get triggered. It'll be a collection of things, bond prices, the dollar value, blah, 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 gold, commodities, all that. But nobody should be doing binary like I'm all over here and then I run over and do all of that. You should be hedging right now and making sure that you have your wealth in primary and secondary wealth right now. That's land. raw land. Primary wealth is, rich soils, good clean water, any mineral rights you can get your hands on, things like that. And then secondary wealth would be the means of production. For me, it's having 2 fence chargers, not one. It's, things like that. So I would highly recommend having that. That's how you begin to hedge against this stuff. And of course, the best way at every level, if inflation really starts to roar along, is you pre-buy things, right? So much better to buy 3 pairs of jeans today, knowing you'll use them over the next few years, than to buy them over the next few years, where they are doubling in price every time you buy them. So if we start to see those signs of inflation, we'll be putting out that alert. Gets complicated this time, Adam, because I think we're going to see supply shortfall. There's 2 reasons prices go up. 1, too much money chasing too few goods. 2, the supply chains break down and there's just less stuff, and so you see the price go up. That's a different dynamic than
Right.
monetary inflation.
Right. All right. We are coming up on our 10-minute extension deadline. I want to knock out a couple quick ones. One, somebody asked what books had been very influential for Chris and I, and I'm also going to put in that other peak prosperity readers. About a year ago, we put together a list of books that we thought were all sort of, seminal books for the folks who are developing or share the peak prosperity mindset. I've just posted a link to that here. So if you want to see what's influenced us, you can read that. There are other books I'd love to chat on that too, but that's going to have to wait for a different day. Somebody asked here about, are we ever going to do a article, post, webinar, or whatever about investing in timberland? And Chris, that's something you've mentioned many times over the years. I know it's on my radar to set up an interview with the guys at Precious Timber, which is a company. It's outside of the U.S. It's based, I think, in Nicaragua, if I'm not mistaken. But it's sort of a pure play on how you can invest in timberland without having to own your own lot and manage and log your trees yourself. But beyond that, Chris, is that something that you think we do a premium report on at some point in time? And are you still looking at timberland as a personal investment for yourself?
Yeah. I actually think timberland is going to be just a fantastic investment going forward. It's an actual primary wealth, and can be rapidly converted into secondary wealth pretty easily, whether that's getting converted into something humans use like pellets or for heating, or cordwood or timber, things like that. And I do think that in the future, we're going to see a lot of pressure to own those sorts of primary bits of wealth again. So I like it. And my personal metric, to tie into another question I saw somebody ask, which is, my gold and my silver are both sitting there for the time when I can, on a ratio basis, exchange them for productive land. That could be timberland, it could be farmland, could be residential real estate or something like that, some productive asset. So the time isn't now. So, in my own personal scheme of timing, Adam, I think gold and silver are still undervalued relative to these other assets I want. I think there's going to be a time when that reverses, and I'm hoping I'm smart enough to know exactly when that is. But because I'm not, I will be sort of making that trade as we go along through time. But it's never been my intention to buy gold and hold it for the rest of my natural life. It's always been to take those chips off the table while I'm uncertain about how things are going to unfold, knowing that what I really want are those local productive assets that I can touch and feel and understand.
Yeah, and not only will we be looking closely at that, but we have our good friend Mike Maloney over at Gold Silver, who is sort of an expert in terms of the pricing of gold and silver and their ratios to other key assets. And we know that he's actually beginning to exchange some for the types of primary capital you're talking about. And I know right now he's doing it mostly because he doesn't have that capital. So he's a little bit price insensitive, meaning he's just doing it because he really wants the land, right? And he wants those sustainable infrastructure investments in place. But he too, will be telling us when he thinks, okay, historically, this is a great ratio of gold to land, go get more land. And we'll obviously be sharing that with folks here. All right, with that, I always like to try to end, with folks able to get a little bit, more of their personal questions for Chris and I, their human interest questions out, because we spend so much time on the serious material and the rest of the webinar. I've got one question here, but I'll look to see if anybody has any additional ones they want us to quickly hit here before we hop off. Before I ask this question though, Chris, I didn't have a chance to create a poll, which I normally do before these. So folks, just use the chat screen here. Would you like us to do another one of these soon or not is the question. Just put yes or no in there, and we will act accordingly. All right, so the question here came from Karen, who said she was curious about how we met, since we live on opposite coasts and make such a great team, which is a very kind thing to say. Do you want to answer that, or do you want me to?
No, that's yours. Take that away.
The shortest answer I can give is back in 2006, 7, 8. I was going through the journey that I think most of you did, where you're online trying to get a better understanding of what's going on because your gut is telling you that something isn't quite right with where the economy is headed and how the world is being run. And in my exploration, I tried to talk to my brother about these concerns for years and years, and he wasn't very interested. But for some reason, something triggered his taking of the red pill, or whatever you want to say. And he sent me a video and said, "Oh, you should check out this video." And it was a link to the crash course. And that was when Chris was putting out the chapters one at a time. And I started watching him as I was reading other sites out there, Zero Hedge, Charles Hugh Smith's blogs, probably all the different sites you folks are well familiar with. And when it came time for me to, when I got to the point where I was working at Yahoo at the time, I was an executive there. When I got to the point where I just couldn't continue to go into work anymore because I didn't feel that the work that I was doing was making a difference for the type of future that I saw coming, I really wanted to be a part of a movement of helping educate people about the real rules of the game that was in play so that they could make smart decisions. And so I wanted to somehow get access to these people that I'd been following for years and see if there might be an opportunity to sort of help them in their missions. And so I invited Chris and Charles and Axel Merck and Patrick from Patrick.net at that point in time to come to Yahoo, which was ostensibly, a public service to my peers at the company who I wanted to get exposure to this information. But very selfishly, I wanted to meet these guys and see if there was a way in which I might be able to find a way to work in their ecosystem. And Chris was the keynote speaker. I went out to dinner with him and Axel and Charles and Patrick that night, and it was like having my own personal heroes just to myself for 2 hours. It was an amazing experience. Super fun too, because they all knew each other, but they had neither met in person, and none had met in person before. So it was really fun to see them get to riff off each other for the first time live. And soon after Chris left, he gave me a call and said, "Hey, you mentioned you were leaving Yahoo. Tell me more about that, because I've just launched this crash course series. It's gotten really popular. I kind of have a tiger by the tail, and I'm just one guy. I'm not scalable. I'd really love to work with somebody like you who understands digital media, has got a business background. Maybe we can leverage each other's talents." And I said, "Gosh, you know what? That might just be a marriage made in heaven." And sort of the rest is history. So that's my perspective. Whatever you want to add to that, Chris, you can add.
Well, yeah, I think that answer was a little out there, Adam.
Yeah. Was it that far out there? Actually,
just playing around with my Zoom backgrounds here. All right.
If you search up Chris Martenson Yahoo on YouTube, I think you'll still find the footage there from the day that we met, where you went and gave, it's footage of your presentation there to the crew at Yahoo. So yeah. It begins with you and me shaking hands, and that may be the first time that we were in the same room together and shaking hands.
Yep. And indeed, that was it's exactly how you described it. And this is really important. So if you really want to meet somebody, just reach out. And I'm really glad Adam did, because I really couldn't have gotten nearly as far as we've gotten together. There's that old African proverb which says, if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go far, go together. And so we're now in the process of trying to figure out how to go even farther at this point. I think the COVID has managed to really open up the territory for how we do things, which is to be, it's not to be just all heady, but we're using logic and consistency and operating with integrity and things that seem to be in short supply. And so we started to assemble, our tribe, as it were, our, meaning not Adam's and my tribe, but our collective tribe, everybody listening and beyond. So this is actually a pretty big moment in time. And so I can feel like 2008, when the Crash Course came out, was a moment where they were cracked open to new ideas. And then 10 years of printing sort of blunted that a little bit. But I think this has come back around again. And by this, I mean the opportunity to talk about things that really matter. And I think that what COVID has done for a lot of people is taught them who matters in their life, and it's taught them what matters in their life. And that's fantastic. And so I think a lot of the future is going to be very different. So welcome to the future. It's arrived, here we are. And I'm really glad that everybody found it. So, hey, thanks so much for listening, everybody. And we'll do this again. Saw a lot of, absolutely's. And sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions. Oh, that's a very big cat you have there.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to show that we are men of our word here at Peak Prosperity. I think the last time we filmed one of these, I said that my family was getting their lockdown puppy. And so this is she. Yeah.
Oh, look at that.
Hi, everybody. This is Bodega. We name our animals after cities. Her sibling, the Silver Lab, you folks have probably seen, that's Boston. But this is Bodega. It's named after Bodega Bay. We call her Bodie for short. And she is very tired right now because normally she is a lot more hyper than this.
Yeah, look at that. That's a calm dog.
Right. Anyways, very well said, Chris. And yes, we did not get to a lot of questions as usual, but looking at the chat here, looks like folks are eager for another one of these. So as soon as Chris and I can fit it into the schedule, we will broadcast that on the site, and then we'll hold this again. As Chris mentioned too, we are looking to see how much further and faster we can take the whole Peak Prosperity movement. We do have a number of really exciting irons in that fire, which we hope to be able to share with you as some of that stuff gets really locked in. But just know that this movement that we are all a part of continues to grow, and hopefully will continue to get even more resources behind it to help it reach more people and help more people take the type of steps that we're talking about here. So with that, Chris, get out there and enjoy the rest of the sunshine on this beautiful Saturday. I am going to head out and meet my pickleball opponent, who's probably wondering what happened to me. But thanks, everybody, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll be back soon. And I got to go garden.